French President Emmanuel Macron has condemned fuel tax protests, which have seen 2 deaths as well as hundreds of people injured. Those behind the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protests, have vowed to block more roads as the government pushes on with economic reforms. Inspired by demonstrations in mainland France, protesters on the Indian Ocean island of Réunion have been blocking access to oil depots in further unrest. Brian Carter has the story.
A call to action across France in protest at the rising cost of diesel and petrol is even being answered on the overseas territory of Réunion. An eruption of violence not seen in 30 years on the island has resulted in scores injured or arrested. It sparked the need for a curfew and condemnation from President Emmanuel Macron.
On public order, I say it clearly. I have asked the government to be inflexible because the scenes in La Réunion and elsewhere are unacceptable.
In the rest of France, the protests have been on the wane since Saturday's mass demonstrations. But in Nantes on Wednesday, the roadblocks were back. The yellow vests, so called after the high visibility jackets motorists are required to carry in their cars, once again blocked motorways and roundabouts.
We will keep going 24 hours a day until Mr. Macron tells us, yes, we hear you, because he's forgetting us and he doesn't realize his popularity is dropping. We are now defending the people, we are defending everyone.
The Gilets jaunes protest has even reached France's National Assembly. Member of Parliament Jean Lassalle wore his yellow high-vis jacket in a sign of solidarity but disrupted proceedings. The Yellow Vest movement may have begun as a backlash against government taxes adding to fuel hikes, but it quickly tapped to frustration at a president perceived as squeezing the less well-off while cutting taxes for the rich. A new call for mobilization has been launched to block the French capital this Saturday.
Well, let's get an update from Brian Carter, who is in Paris for us this morning. Good morning, Brian. What impact, if any, are these protests likely to have on Macron's planned economic reforms?
Good morning, Belle. Well, at the moment, the government doesn't seem to be backing down on its reforms, especially now that, as I said in the video you just saw, the movement seems to be phasing down. Yesterday, we only counted 7,000 protesters across France at different locations in France, and that number has been gradually diminishing over the last few days. The government says that despite these protests, they will continue with the reform, especially the reform on fuel that will see another price hike in January. They say that this reform is necessary to fight against climate change and for ecological transition. But clearly the government seems to be on the defensive, probably for the first time since Macron came to power. They said initially that they want to discuss. Now they seem to be more open to dialogue. And even though the number of protesters has been gradually diminishing, the anger is clearly still there. You know, initially this movement was against the price of fuel, but it's morphed into much more against the loss of public services, against the cost of living, and it really showed a divide between urban France and rural France, especially rural France, where the car is needed to get to different places, and where public services have been gradually diminishing over the last few days. So clearly the anger is still there, is still being expressed. A majority of the French people support the Yellow Vest movement, and some in France are already comparing it to the Five-Star Movement in Italy.
And Brian, you talked there about the anger still being there. How long are we expecting these protests to continue?
Well, Belle, here on Saturday there will be a big protest. Thousands of people are expected. There have been 2 different calls on social media. More than 30,000 people said they were going to be there, and more than 200,000 said they were interested. They called for a complete shutdown of the capital. They call on people to come from all over France. So clearly, the success of this demonstration on Saturday will be a measure about this movement, whether this movement is here to stay or whether it was just a brief moment in French political life.